Prymia was returning from the stream when the wind changed direction. She stopped walking. The forest was dark and breathless around her, the kind of dark that lives between stars, and she had learned long ago that this forest did not change without reason. She held her torch higher and waited. Then the smell reached her, blood, warm and heavy, cutting through the pine and cold earth like a blade, and beneath it, something else entirely, something ancient and overwhelming, something so deeply alpha that her instincts folded inward like a creature seeking shelter. She should have turned back. Her feet had already begun to do exactly that. Instead, she followed the smell. She found him 40 paces off the trail. Enormous. Collapsed against the roots of an old oak, one hand pressed to his side. Red hair dark with sweat, ruined armor split open along his left flank. His eyes were half open, amber, glassy, refusing to beg even as his breath came in slow, broken pieces. He said something when she stepped close. She leaned in to hear it. It sounded almost like "go away." "You are bleeding through your hand," she said, steadier than she had any right to be. "Stop moving." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, as if the decision cost him something, he went still. Getting him to the cabin nearly broke her. He was heavy with muscle and iron and everything a body becomes when it is losing its fight quietly. She did not let go. When she finally laid him on her bed, he was already gone. Eyes closed, chest barely moving, the firelight catching the red of his beard and the sharp, still lines of his face. Prymia stood over him and did not move. She did not know who he was. She pulled her medicine box from beneath the table, sat at the edge of the mattress, and got to work. The fever came before midnight. Prymia had expected it, or something like it. She had seen enough wounds in her years of solitude to know that a blade did not simply cut. A blade carried everything the hand behind it intended, and sometimes it carried more than that. Sometimes it carried filth. Sometimes it carried poison. And the wound in this stranger's side, when she finally peeled back the ruined leather of his armor and the soaked linen beneath it, told her very clearly that whoever had done this had not merely wanted him dead. They had wanted to make certain of it. The cut itself was deep, but clean. A single stroke, angled precisely, the kind that came from someone who knew exactly where to place a blade to ensure a slow ending rather than a fast one. But around the edges of it, the skin had already begun to darken. Not the natural bruising of a wound. Something else. Something she recognized from a preparation her grandmother had taught her to watch for, a combination of crushed nightroot and iron bloom that spread through the blood like cold smoke and made the body turn against itself from the inside. She had worked quickly then, more quickly than she had worked at anything in years. Her medicine box was old and well used, the wood of it darkened from handling, the smell of it a complicated mixture of dried bark and oil, and things that had no name in the common tongue. She had built its contents over a decade of living alone, a decade of learning what the forest gave and what it withheld, what healed and what merely appeared to. She knew what she needed, and she moved to gather it with the focused quiet of someone who understood that efficiency was a form of mercy. The poultice came first, a thick paste of silverweed and ground ember root, packed directly into the wound with practiced hands, her fingers pressing gently but firmly until she was certain the drawing agent was settled deep enough to do its work. She bound it with clean linen, her last clean linen, wrapping it tight and then tighter still, because his body would try to shake it loose before the night was over, and she intended to make that as difficult as possible. Then she prepared the tea, a bitter compound that she forced between his barely parted lips, a spoonful at a time, holding his jaw with one hand and tilting his head with the other, waiting between each small measure to ensure he swallowed without choking. He swallowed, barely. But he swallowed. Then the fever arrived like weather. It did not build gradually the way fevers sometimes did. the slow warmth, the flush, the drift into discomfort. It came all at once, a tide of heat that rose through him with terrifying speed, turning the skin beneath her palm, scalding within the span of minutes. His breathing, which had been shallow and too slow, became rapid and unsteady. His body shifted on the narrow bed, his massive shoulders moving against the linen, his head turning from side to side, with a restlessness that had nothing to do with consciousness and everything to do with something deeper. The body waging war on behalf of a mind that was no longer present to direct it. Prymia pressed a damp cloth to his forehead and kept it there. "Stay," she said, not because she thought he could hear her, but because silence felt dangerous. The cabin was small and warm from the fire she had built up in the corner, and outside the forest stood dark and still, and inside there was only her and this enormous stranger, and the sound of his ragged breathing, and the soft occasional crackle of the flames. She kept talking, low and even, the way one speaks to a frightened animal. Not in words that meant anything specific, just in the steady rhythm of a human voice, reminding something living that it was not alone. He moved suddenly. His arm came up fast enough that she barely pulled back in time, his hand closing on empty air where her wrist had been half a second before, his whole body shifting with a surge of strength that seemed impossible given the state of him. His eyes opened, but they were not seeing her. They were seeing something else, something in whatever landscape the fever had constructed behind them, and his expression was the expression of a man who had spent a long time giving orders and was still trying to give them now, even from the far side of consciousness. "Hold the eastern line," he said, or something very close to that. His voice was rough and low and fractured at the edges, the words running together, accented with something she could not place. "Do not let them reach the—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. His hand, still raised, fell back against the mattress. "Sven." The name came out differently than the rest, softer, something almost alarmed in it. "Sven, fall back." Prymia watched him. She had learned, over years of solitude, to read faces the way other people read words, carefully, with patience, understanding that the meaning was often not in what was presented, but in what lay just beneath. And what she read in this man's face, even fevered and unconscious and locked inside some internal battle she could not see, was not weakness. It was grief. A very old, very controlled grief that his body had only allowed to surface now, in the only moment he could not stop it. She pressed the cloth to his forehead again. "You are safe," she said. She was not certain it was true. She was not even certain what safe would mean for a man like this. But she said it anyway, and his body, after a long, trembling moment, eased. The night passed in intervals. She worked through them all, checking the wound, replacing the poultice when it drew enough of the poison to be spent, reboiling the medicine and getting more of it into him with patient persistence, cooling him when the fever spiked and covering him when it briefly receded. She ground more silverweed by the light of a single candle when her supply ran low. She checked the binding twice, then 3 times, satisfying herself that it held. She watched the color of the skin around the wound with the anxious focus of someone who understood that the difference between the shade it was and the shade it must not become was the difference between life and its absence. There were more words from him as the night went on. Fragments, mostly. Names she did not know, places she could not identify, commands that dissolved before they were finished. Once he said something that sounded like an apology, the single word "forgive" surfacing clear and alone from the murk of everything else, before his breathing steadied again into something closer to sleep. Prymia did not ask who he was apologizing to. Some things were not hers to know. Somewhere in the last hours of the night, between the darkness and the first gray suggestion of dawn beginning to press against the cabin's single window, the fever broke. She felt it happen, felt the scorching tension leave his skin by degrees, felt his breathing lose its frantic edge and find something slower, something that was almost but not quite natural rest. The lines of his face, which had been pulled tight by pain and whatever the fever was making him fight, went smooth. He looked younger without them. Still formidable in the way that certain mountains are formidable, even from a distance, even in stillness, but younger, less like a weapon and more like something that might once have been a boy who had not yet decided that softness was a liability. She sat back in her chair. It was a hard chair. She had made it herself from leftover pine, and she had never managed to make it comfortable, which had not bothered her because she had never intended to sit in it for a full night. Her back made a complaint about this that she ignored. Her hands, stained faintly from the herbs, rested in her lap. The fire had burned down to deep coals that threw a low amber light across the cabin, across the sleeping man in her bed, across the dark braids of her own hair that had come half loose from their binding somewhere around the 3rd hour of the night. She meant only to close her eyes for a moment. She meant to rest them, just briefly, before checking the wound one final time in the growing light of morning. She meant to remain alert, because she did not know this man, because she did not know who had tried to kill him or whether they might follow, because she was a woman alone in a forest, and solitude had taught her the cost of carelessness. She was asleep before the thought had finished. She did not hear, could not have heard, the small change in his breathing when it happened, could not have seen the way his chest slowed and deepened and then paused, the pause of a man surfacing rather than sinking. Could not have seen his eyes open, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone unsure what they would find, and settle on the ceiling above him first. The unfamiliar wood of it, the dried herbs hanging in neat bundles, the low firelight. Could not have seen the moment his gaze moved and found her. She was asleep in the chair at the edge of his bed, her head tilted slightly to one side, her hands still loosely folded in her lap. Her hair, that dark cloud of half-loosened braids, had fallen forward across her shoulder. Her face, in sleep, had lost whatever careful arrangement she maintained while awake, the controlled expression, the practical set of her jaw. She looked, without those defenses, like something quieter, something that had not slept enough in a very long time. He did not move. He lay completely still and looked at her, and the confusion on his face was not the confusion of a man who does not know where he is. He was already cataloging the cabin, assessing it, filing it with the automatic efficiency of someone accustomed to waking in unfamiliar places. The confusion was something else, something that lived in the space between his brows and could not quite be resolved. He could smell her. That was the thing he could not make sense of, the thing that had pulled him up from whatever depth the fever had dropped him into. Her scent was all around him, in the linen he lay on, in the air of the small, warm cabin, close and present and profoundly, inexplicably settling in a way that no smell had a right to be. Herbs and clean water and something beneath those things that he had no category for, something that his body recognized without his permission and filed under a heading he had long since thought empty. He was a man who had stopped expecting to be surprised. And yet, he watched her sleep for a long moment longer than he should have. Then, with the slow discipline of a man reimposing order on a situation that had briefly exceeded his control, he closed his eyes. He would figure out where he was. He would figure out who she was. He would figure out how much she had seen, what she had heard, what she knew. He would do all of that. Later. For now, inexplicably, and against every instinct, he had spent 32 years sharpening into weapons. He slept, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the sleep held nothing but silence. Outside, the forest was turning gold at the edges, and the day that was coming had no idea what it was about to begin. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will touch your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The sound came before the light. Prymia heard it in the thin layer of sleep she had managed to find. Hooves, distant at first, then less distant, then close enough that the sound of them moved through the ground beneath the cabin and up through the legs of her chair and into her bones before her eyes had fully opened. She was on her feet before she understood why, her body acting on instincts that her mind was still assembling, and in the 2 seconds it took her to cross the cabin floor, she had already catalogued everything. The man still unconscious in her bed. The fire burned down to coals. The pale suggestion of pre-dawn pressing at the edges of the window, and outside, growing louder with every heartbeat. The sound of more than one horse moving fast through trees that were not built for speed. She reached the window. There were torches between the trees, 4 of them, maybe 5, moving in tight formation through the dark of the forest with the kind of directional certainty that told her they were not searching. They knew exactly where they were going. They had known before they arrived. She stepped back from the window. There was no time to think about what that meant. There was only the door, and the half-second before it became irrelevant, and the decision of whether to put herself in front of it or behind it. She chose in front of it, and she had barely planted her feet when the door came open with a force that was not quite violence, but left no room for the suggestion of welcome. Light poured in ahead of them, torchlight, harsh and orange, flooding the small cabin and throwing hard shadows against every wall. 4 men, large, armored, weapons at their sides. Not drawn, she noted, but close enough to drawn that the difference was a formality. They moved with the particular economy of men who had trained the hesitation out of themselves, who had replaced it with assessment and response so thoroughly that the two had become a single motion. The first one through the door swept the cabin with his eyes in under a second. Her, the fire, the table, the bed. He stopped. The others stopped behind him. The silence that followed was extraordinary. Not the silence of surprise. Prymia had been braced for that, for the noise of it, for demands and drawn blades, and the kind of confrontation she had been rehearsing answers to in the 3 seconds she'd had to prepare. This was a different silence entirely. This was the silence of something landing. Of something enormous and invisible, settling over the 4 men like a physical weight, changing the shape of them, pulling their postures into something she had no word for except reverence. The first man, tall, dark-haired, a scar running through his left brow, crossed the cabin in 4 strides and stopped at the edge of her bed. He looked down at the man sleeping in it. He looked for a long time. Then, slowly, with the kind of deliberateness that was its own form of ceremony, he went to one knee. "My king," he said. The words were barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the cabin, they landed like stones dropped into still water, and the rings they made spread outward and reached Prymia, where she stood by the door and went through her, and kept going. "My king." She did not move. She was not certain she was breathing. The man on his knee, she would learn later that his name was Victor, that he was the king's second in command, that he had not slept in 2 days, rose and turned to look at her with eyes that were precise and unreadable and doing something very rapid and very thorough behind their surface. He looked at her the way one looks at a thing that does not fit into any existing category, a thing that requires a new category to be constructed before it can be properly filed. "You treated him," he said. It was not a question. Prymia found her voice somewhere below her sternum and brought it up with effort. "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." He looked at the wound binding visible above the blanket she had laid over him, at the carefully cleaned skin around it, at the precise layering of the linen that only someone who knew what they were doing would have managed in the dark with limited supplies and a patient who kept trying to move. Something in his expression shifted, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. He said something to the others in a low voice that she was not meant to hear, and 2 of them moved immediately to the bed, positioning themselves on either side of it, with the practiced coordination of men who had done this before, who had carried this specific weight before, in other places, from other fields. They lifted him. Prymia watched them do it with a sensation she could not name, something that was partly alarm and partly something else, something that had no business being there, a pulling in the chest that she attributed immediately to the practical concern of a healer watching a patient be moved before the wound had properly settled. That was what it was. She was certain of it. His fever broke in the early hours, she said, because she needed to say something useful, something that kept her in the role she understood. The blade carried nightroot poison. I drew most of it out, but he will need silverweed poultice, changed every 8 hours for the next 3 days. If the skin around the wound begins to darken again, it will be handled, Victor said. She stopped. He looked at her again, that same rapid, unreadable assessment, and then he moved toward the door where the others were already carrying the king out into the dark, with a care that was extraordinary for men that size, with a gentleness that sat strangely on their armored shoulders, like something borrowed. At the threshold, Victor paused. He turned back to her, one hand on the doorframe, the torchlight from outside cutting across the scar on his brow. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You did not know who he was," he said. It was not a question this time either, but she answered it. "No." He nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already concluded. Then he stepped out of her cabin and pulled the door shut behind him, and the sound of hooves rose again and moved away through the trees, growing thinner and thinner until the forest swallowed it entirely, and there was nothing left but the silence and the fire and the empty bed. Prymia stood in the middle of her cabin for a long time. The linen on the bed was still warm. They rode through what remained of the night and into the gray morning, and by the time the great stone walls of Goldenmoon Fortress rose against the pale sky, the king had not opened his eyes once. Victor rode at the front with his jaw set and his thoughts moving at a speed he kept rigorously off his face, because his face was a thing that his warriors read constantly, and he could not afford for them to read what he was actually thinking, which was that the timing of this was catastrophic, and that whoever had poisoned the blade was going to discover, at considerable personal cost, that there were things in this world worse than a fast death. The gates opened before they reached them. Someone had ridden ahead. The courtyard was lit and waiting. Stable hands, a handful of castle guard, and moving through them with the brisk authority of a woman who treated urgency as an inconvenience rather than an emergency. Ingrid Dahl, the king's physician. She was a small woman of middle years, with silver-streaked hair and hands that had forgotten more about medicine than most people ever learned. And she reached the horse before it had fully stopped and had her hands on the king's face within seconds. "How long?" she said. "Since last night," Victor said, dismounting. He was found in the forest east of the Ymir ridgeline, nightroot in the blade. Ingrid's expression did not change, but her hands moved faster. Who treated him? A woman, alone, in the forest. This did pause her briefly. A healer? She knew about the nightroot. She had already drawn most of it. The binding work was... He stopped. Competent. Ingrid, who had known Victor for 11 years and knew that competent from his mouth meant something considerably stronger, said nothing further on the subject and directed the men carrying the king toward the east tower with the decisive efficiency of someone rerouting a river. The room they brought him to was large and warm, with a fire already burning and clean linen already on the bed, because Ingrid had learned, in her years of service to this particular king, that preparing for disasters before they fully arrived was the only way to manage them. She examined the wound within minutes of laying him down, and what she found made her go still for a moment in a way she rarely did. The poultice was correctly formulated. The binding was correctly placed and correctly tensioned. The fever had been managed. She could see evidence of it in the cloth left beside the bed, in the residue of the bitter compound on his lips, in the careful, considered way that every element of the treatment had been layered, one upon the next, without waste and without error. In the dark. Alone. With whatever a woman living in a forest cabin had to hand. Ingrid did not say anything about this to anyone. She simply got to work. She changed the poultice, reinforced the binding with better linen, administered a cleaner formulation of the fever compound and a second agent to support the blood, checked his temperature and his pulse and the color of the wound edge with meticulous attention, and then sat back and concluded that whoever the woman in the forest was, she had kept this man alive through the worst of it, and that was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. She told Victor the king would sleep through the day, probably through the night as well. She was almost right. It was 2 days later when Festus Goldenmoon opened his eyes fully for the first time. Not the half-opening of fever dreams, not the brief surfacing he had managed in the dark of a small, warm cabin before something pulled him back down. Fully. Completely. With the particular quality of wakefulness that comes after the body has finally finished doing what it needed to do and has decided to return occupancy to the mind. He lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. Stone. High. The crack above the third beam that he had meant to have repaired for 2 years and kept not repairing, partly from inertia and partly because he had developed a faint, irrational attachment to it. He was in his own room. He was in his own bed, which was considerably larger and considerably more structured than what he had been lying on before, and the difference registered with a clarity that told him his senses were back in order. He took inventory. The wound, present, bound, aching with a deep, dull persistence that told him it was healing rather than worsening. The fever, gone. The strange heaviness in his blood that had been the poison, diminished to a faint residue, manageable, retreating. He breathed in and out slowly and let the inventory complete itself, and then lay there for another moment in the clean stone and fire smell of his own chamber. Something was missing. He identified it before he could stop himself, before he could apply the usual filters and redirect the thought into something more appropriate for a man of his position and disposition. The smell of the small cabin was gone. The pine and earth and herbs and that other thing, that particular warm thread underneath everything else that had wound through his sleep and kept it quiet in a way that his sleep had not been quiet in years. It was gone, and the absence of it was noticeable, in the same way that the absence of a sound one has grown used to is noticeable. The silence of it. He sat up. Ingrid was in the chair by the fire, asleep over a book with the resigned expertise of a woman who had learned to sleep in chairs because kings had inconvenient schedules. Victor was standing by the window, which meant Victor had not slept at all, which was a problem Festus had been failing to solve for the better part of a decade. Victor. Victor turned from the window with the immediacy of a man who had been waiting and said nothing because he was good at waiting and better at saying nothing. "How long?" Festus said. 2 days, my king." He absorbed this. 2 days was workable. Costly, but workable. There were things that would need to be addressed, pieces that would need to be moved, and the matter of whoever had put nightroot on a blade and aimed it at him was a conversation that was going to be very one-sided and very final. But those were manageable things, known things, things that had shape and dimension and could be approached with method. He looked at his hands, at the careful binding on his torso, at the particular quality of the poultice work he could feel against his skin. Different from Ingrid's technique. He knew Ingrid's technique. This was someone else's. "The woman," he said. Victor was quiet for precisely 1 second longer than he needed to be, which told Festus more than most full sentences would have. "The woman in the forest," Festus said, "who treated me before you arrived. Who is she?" "We don't know her name," Victor said. "She lives alone. East of the Emir ridgeline, an hour into the forest. A cabin, no visible clan markings. She identified the nightroot poison and treated it correctly with what she had available." He paused. She did not know who you were." Festus said nothing. He looked at the window, at the pale light coming through it, and something moved behind his eyes. Something he catalogued and did not examine, and set carefully aside in a place he intended to return to. "Find her," he said. Victor's expression remained still. "My king. Her name, her origin, her clan, if she has one." He looked back at his hands. At the work done on them in the dark of a forest cabin by someone who had not known and had not cared and had simply stayed. "I want to know who she is." Victor nodded once and moved toward the door. "Victor." He stopped. Festus was still looking at the window, at the direction of the forest, though the forest was not visible from here, and he knew it. "She is not to be disturbed," he said. "Not yet. Find out who she is first." The door closed quietly. Ingrid slept on in her chair, undisturbed by any of it. And Festus Goldenmoon, king of the northern clans, lay back against his pillow and stared at the ceiling and thought about a smell he could not name, and a pair of hands that had not shaken, and a woman in a dark forest who had looked at him, not at what he was, not at what he represented, and told him, with complete and unreasonable calm, to stop moving. He closed his eyes. For the first time in his adult life, he did not know what came next, and somehow, inexplicably, that felt less like a problem than it should have. Outside the window, somewhere far beyond the stone walls and the courtyard and the long road east, a forest stood quiet in the morning light. And in a small cabin at its center, a woman with dark braided hair sat at a table she had built herself and stared at the empty bed across the room and told herself, firmly and repeatedly, that she was not thinking about anything at all. She was not particularly convincing. The order came on the third morning. Victor had expected it. He had expected it, in fact, since the moment the king had opened his eyes and said find her with that particular quality of stillness in his voice that meant the subject was not open for discussion, expansion, or delay. He had spent the 2 days since doing exactly that, finding her, and what he had found had given him more questions than answers, which was an unusual and mildly uncomfortable position for a man who prided himself on answers. Her name was Prymia Nightfang. That was the part that was easy. A name was a name, and names left traces even when the people who carried them tried not to. The woman who sold dried herbs at the edge of the forest market knew her. The old man who maintained the Emir Ridge Trail knew her. 3 people in the nearest village knew her face and knew she lived alone, and knew she had lived alone for long enough that no one questioned it anymore, which told Victor something about the length of her solitude without telling him anything about its cause. What he could not find was a clan. There were no markings, no allegiances, no visible family name attached to Nightfang beyond the name itself, which was old and northern and connected to nothing he could trace in the records he had access to, which were considerable. She had appeared in this forest the way certain things appear in deep water, present, fully formed, with no visible point of entry. Whatever she had been before she became a woman alone in a cabin between the trees was buried under years of deliberate absence, and Victor, who respected deliberate absence because he practiced it himself, had decided not to dig further without cause. He had brought the king what he had. Festus had listened to all of it without expression, which was normal, and without interruption, which was less so. He was a man who interrupted with precision, who asked questions in the middle of answers because the middle was usually where the useful things hid. The fact that he let Victor finish the entire account without a word meant he was listening to something other than the words. When Victor finished, the king was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Bring her." Victor had known it was coming. He had spent 2 days knowing it was coming, which had given him 2 days to think about how to do it correctly, which meant how to do it in a way that did not alarm her further than the arrival of 8 armed warriors on horseback at the door of an isolated woman's home was already going to alarm her, which was a significant ceiling to work beneath. He had chosen his 4 best men, not his largest, though they were all large, because the king's warriors were selected in part precisely for that, and there was no getting around it. But his most controlled. The ones who had learned to wear their size without using it, who could stand in a doorway and take up all the space it offered, and still somehow communicate that the space was negotiable. Henrik Berg, who had a calm about him that animals responded to. Leif Anderson, who had spent 3 years in the eastern villages before joining the King's Guard and understood the particular mathematics of civilian trust. 2 others for escort and presence, because arriving with 2 men said something different than arriving with 4, and he wanted what they said upon arrival to be legible and unambiguous. They rode east at first light. Prymia was splitting wood. This was not because she needed the wood. She had enough wood stacked against the side of the cabin to last her through the next 2 winters, and possibly the one after that, because she had learned early that having enough of a thing was not the same as having too much, and that the body did not always agree with the mind about which category applied. She was splitting wood because she needed something to do with her hands, and her hands had been restless for 3 days in a way they had never been restless before. Not in all the years she had lived here, not through winters or illness or the ordinary loneliness that she had long since made her peace with. The ordinary loneliness was a known quantity. She had measured it and mapped it and understood its edges. It did not behave the way it was supposed to anymore, and she could not identify the exact point at which it had changed, except that the point was approximately 3 days ago and had arrived in the dark and been enormous and had bled on her linen. She swung the axe. The wood split cleanly. She set the pieces aside and set up the next one, and did not think about anything at all, which she was achieving with considerable effort and moderate success. The sound reached her before the sight of them did. Hooves on the soft ground of the forest path, multiple horses moving at a pace that was deliberate rather than urgent. She stilled. Her hands held the axe loosely at her side, and she stood with the particular quality of stillness she had developed over years of living in a place where sounds meant things, and things arrived without warning, and she listened to the sound get closer and identified approximately how many horses it represented, and then looked up when the first of them came through the trees into the clearing in front of her cabin. 4 riders, armored, all of them, with the markings of a northern clan on their chest plates, markings she recognized now with a knowledge she had not possessed 4 days ago. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The first one, dark-haired with a calm face and the posture of someone accustomed to arriving in places where he was not expected, looked at her without the kind of appraisal that she had learned to brace for from men of that size and bearing. He just looked. "Prymia Nightfang," he said. It was not quite a question. She set the axe head down in the dirt and rested her hands on the top of the handle. "Yes. My name is Henrik Berg. I serve King Festus Goldenmoon." He paused there, the way one pauses to let a name land where it will land. "The king has requested your presence at Goldenmoon Fortress." Prymia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the 3 behind him. Same bearing, same controlled stillness, same deliberate absence of threat in the way they held themselves. She looked back at Henrik. "Requested," she said. Something moved briefly in Henrik's expression, something that in another man, in a less serious situation, she might have called amusement. "The king's requests and his commands occupy a similar position," he said, with the tone of a man choosing honesty over diplomacy and finding the choice straightforward. "You would not be compelled, but he is asking." "He is asking," she said, "from a castle, through 4 armed riders, which is one way to ask." Henrik conceded this with a small inclination of his head that she found, despite herself, unexpectedly decent. "He wants to speak with you. The reason he gave was—" He paused again. "That you saved his life." Prymia looked at the cabin behind her, at the window with its dried herbs on the sill. At the door, she had walked through 1,000 mornings and 1,000 evenings, and would walk through again. Whatever happened, because she had built this life board by board and stone by stone, and it was hers in a way that nothing else had ever been hers. She looked back at the riders. "I need to bank the fire," she said. Henrik nodded. She went inside. She stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, just a moment, and looked at the bed. The linen was still faintly marked where she had not yet managed to fully clean it, where the iron of his blood had left a shadow in the weave that the cold water in her basin had diminished but not erased. She had told herself she would replace the linen. She had not replaced it. She banked the fire. She put on her traveling cloak. Heavy wool, dark, the kind built for forest winters rather than appearances, and she bound her braids more tightly against her head, the long, black ropes of them pinned and secured in the layered northern style that her mother had taught her, before she had stopped being the kind of woman who had a mother to teach her things. She took her herb satchel because she took it everywhere, and leaving it behind would have felt like leaving a hand. She walked out and pulled the door shut. "I am ready," she said. Henrik looked at her from his horse with an expression she still could not fully read, and then the second rider, the one called Leaf, she would learn, brought up a spare horse from the back of the group, a quiet bay mare that stood with patient indifference to the morning and everything in it. Prymia mounted without assistance. Henrik noticed. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on it, which was a kind of comment in itself. They rode. She had not been to the fortress before. She had seen it from the ridge, once, years ago, the dark stone of it, rising against a winter sky, enormous even at that distance, built with the particular stubbornness of a structure that intended to still be standing when everything around it had become something else. Up close, it was different. Not larger exactly, though it was that. More intentional. Every stone placed with a certainty that she found simultaneously impressive and vaguely oppressive, the way things are oppressive when they have been built by someone who never doubted that they had the right to build them. The gates opened before they reached them. The courtyard inside was wide and paved and busy with the controlled movement of a place that ran according to patterns too established to need direction. Stable hands, guards, people moving with purpose in various directions, all of them pausing briefly as the horses came through, some of them looking at her with expressions she catalogued and set aside. She had been looked at in worse ways. She had been looked at in ways that had required her to leave places, and this was not that. This was just curiosity, and she could manage curiosity. A man was waiting at the base of the steps that led up into the fortress. She recognized him before she dismounted, the scar through his brow, the dark hair, the eyes that had catalogued her entire cabin in under a second, and then looked at her with that particular quality of assessment. Victor. The name had reached her through the fog of that morning as the riders took their king, though no one had said it to her directly. She knew it the way she knew certain things, by accumulation, by the way pieces fit together. He looked at her now the same way he had looked at her in the cabin, like something that required a new category. "Prymia Nightfang," he said. "You already know my name," she said. "I suspect you know several things about me." "Several," he agreed, with a directness she appreciated against her will. "The king will see you shortly. He is—" He paused in the way men pause when they are choosing between accuracy and tact, and chose accuracy. "He is recovering well, in some part due to your work." "The night route was the dangerous part," she said. Anyone with silverweed and the sense to use it would not have identified it in the dark by smell alone, Victor said, in a patient they had never met, without a second opinion. He looked at her for a moment. "You can be modest if you prefer. It changes the facts less than you might hope." Prymia said nothing. He gestured for her to follow, and led her up the steps and through a doorway that was high enough to be unnecessary, and she suspected was unnecessary on purpose, because there were rooms, And then there were rooms that were designed to remind you, as you entered them, that you were entering something. She had lived alone in a forest cabin for years. She was harder to remind than most. The corridor beyond was stone and torchlight, and the smell of fires and cold, and something underneath both that was almost but not quite the smell of her cabin. That underlying thread of pine and old mountain air that the North carried in its bones, regardless of how many walls you put around it. Victor stopped at a door. He knocked with a single knuckle. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate. Then, enter. The voice. She knew the voice, not because she had heard it clearly. She had heard it in fragments, in fever-fractured pieces that she had not been able to assemble into anything coherent at the time. But her body knew it, the way her body had known the smell of him in the dark forest, with a certainty that bypassed explanation and arrived fully formed and unwelcome and irrefutably present. She breathed in once, quietly through her nose. Victor opened the door. The room was large. Larger than her entire cabin, though she did not let herself dwell on that, and warm from a fire that was considerably more substantial than anything she maintained, and lined with the particular organized clutter of someone who reads and works and does not particularly care that those two activities tend toward disorder. There were maps on one table, a sword on a stand by the wall, cleaned and sheeted, furs on the floor that she suspected came from animals considerably bigger than anything she had encountered in her forest. He was standing at the window. She had not been prepared for that, for him to be standing, upright, occupying space with his full presence and height and breadth in a way that the unconscious man in her bed had not been able to do. He was wearing a simple tunic, the kind that fastened at the side rather than the front, probably because of the wound, and his red hair was loose and slightly disheveled in the manner of someone who had recently stopped lying down and had not yet addressed the consequences. His beard was the same dark ember red she remembered. His shoulders were exactly as broad as she had understood them to be while trying to move him through a dark forest, which was to say, extremely. He turned from the window. His eyes found her immediately. Dark amber, fully focused, none of the fever glaze that had clouded them when she had last seen them open. They were, she discovered, considerably more affecting when clear. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "You are smaller than I remember," he said. Prymia blinked. "You were barely conscious when we met. Your perceptions may not have been reliable." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the preliminary consideration of one, the infrastructure laid without any commitment to completing the construction. "Perhaps," he said. "You are Prymia Nightfang?" "You are the king," she said. "I am. You did not tell me. I was unconscious." "Before that," she said, "when you were still speaking, you said—" She stopped. She was not entirely certain what she was trying to establish, and she was more certain than she would have liked that he knew it. He watched her for another moment, and then he moved, away from the window, slowly, with the careful precision of a man who was not going to let a wound be visible in his movement and was largely succeeding. He stopped a few paces from her, and up close, he was even more overwhelming than she had been prepared for, which was frustrating because she had specifically prepared for it. "I owe you my life," he said. The words were simple and undecorated and stated with the flat certainty of a man reporting a fact, without performance or embellishment. "I do not owe debts easily. I do not carry them comfortably. I want to know what you want in return." Prymia looked up at him, directly. She was not a short woman, but she was looking up at him, and she had decided before she entered this room that she would not look away first. "I did not do it for payment," she said. "I know that," he said. "That is not what I asked." She held his gaze. Those amber eyes were doing something that she could not name, something that had nothing to do with the practical question he had just asked, and everything to do with whatever question was sitting beneath it, unasked, taking up considerably more space than the room strictly permitted. "I want to go home," she said. The almost smile infrastructure appeared again, and this time it progressed fractionally further. "That," he said quietly, "I am not certain I can give you." The room was very warm. Outside the window, the northern sky was going gold at the edges, where the afternoon light caught the tops of the trees. The tops of her trees, she thought, the ones she knew by name, the ones she had lived among for long enough that their silence had become her silence. She told herself that the warmth in the room was the fire. She was not particularly convincing. She had not been asked. That was the part that stayed with her through the morning after their first meeting, through the afternoon that followed it, through the night she spent in a room that was larger than her entire cabin and smelled of stone and beeswax and the particular absence of pine that made sleeping feel like a foreign exercise. She had not been asked whether she wished to remain at the fortress. She had not been asked whether she had things to return to, fires to tend, a life that did not pause simply because a king had decided it should. She had been given a room, a considerable room, she would admit, with a window that faced east and a bed that was softer than anything she had encountered outside of a fever dream. And a woman named Maya Erickson had appeared at the door with an expression of cheerful determination and an armful of practical information about meal times and bathing schedules and the general geography of the East Wing. And Prymia had stood in the middle of the room and understood that she was being kept in the gentlest and most well-appointed way possible, but kept nonetheless. She had gone to find Victor. Victor had listened to her objections with the focused patience of a man who had heard objections before and had developed, through long practice, the ability to acknowledge them completely without being moved by them in any practical direction. The people who had poisoned the king's blade, he explained, knew that someone in the forest east of the Ymir Ridge had interfered with their plan. They did not know who. They would find out. They were the kind of people who found things out, and they were the kind of people who responded to interference with a thoroughness that Victor did not recommend she experience firsthand. She had stood in the corridor and looked at him and understood that he was not wrong. She had gone back to her room. She had spent 2 days in a state of armed equilibrium, exploring the parts of the fortress that were available to her, which were more than she expected, and avoiding the parts that were not, which she identified through the particular quality of attention the guards gave her when she approached certain corridors. She had visited the fortress's herb stores and spent an instructive hour with the woman who managed them, a quiet and precise person named Ellen Johansson, who had the eyes of someone who had learned to look at plants the way other people looked at faces, for what they were saying rather than what they appeared to be. They had not spoken much. They had not needed to. She had not seen Festus. She had been aware of him the way one is aware of weather, not always visible, but present in the atmosphere, in the altered quality of attention that moved through the fortress when he was nearby, in the voices that adjusted, and the postures that straightened, and the general subtle reorganization of a space around a fixed point. She had heard him once, in a corridor she was not in, his voice carrying through a stone wall with the low resonance of something built for carrying, giving instructions to someone about something she did not hear clearly. She had walked faster. She had not examined why. And then, on the morning of the 3rd day, Maya had knocked on her door with an expression that was carefully arranged to suggest this was entirely routine news delivered in an entirely routine manner, and had informed her that the king was holding a banquet that evening for the allied clan leaders, and that Prymia had been included among the guests. Prymia had stared at her. "Included?" she said. "Yes," Maya said, with the serenity of someone who had delivered more complicated messages on behalf of this particular king and found this one relatively navigable. "Did he ask whether I wished to be included?" Maya's expression remained serene. "The king expressed that he would be pleased by your presence." "That is not the same thing." "No," Maya agreed pleasantly. It is not. Prymia had looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at the window, and then looked back at Maya and said, with the resignation of someone choosing the battle they could win over the battle they could not. I have nothing to wear to a banquet. Maya's serenity achieved a new level. That, she said, has already been considered. What had been considered turned out to be a dress. Not an elaborate one. She suspected that whoever had made this particular decision had understood that elaborate would have been rejected and had chosen accordingly. It was deep green, the color of the forest floor after rain, made of wool that had been woven fine enough to drape rather than hang, with a darker thread worked through it in a pattern so subtle it was almost not there at all. The cut was simple and northern, high-waisted, long-sleeved, a neckline that was modest without being plain. There was a belt of dark leather with a small bronze clasp in the shape of something she could not quite identify, but that felt, somehow, like it had been chosen specifically, rather than generically. Prymia held it and looked at it for a long time. Then she put it on, because the alternative was her traveling cloak, and she had decided that whatever this evening was, she was not going to walk into it looking like she had just emerged from a forest, even if that was, technically, a recent and accurate description of her situation. Maya helped her with her braids, not changing them, not trying to impose a different order on something that was already ordered, but tightening and resecuring them, weaving a thin dark cord through the uppermost ones in a way that pulled the whole architecture of them upward and back, and made the lines of her face feel somehow cleaner, more legible. Prymia sat still and let her work, and did not think about where she was going, or who would be there, or the specific amber quality of a pair of eyes that she had now encountered twice, and that had, both times, made the air in the room behave differently than air was supposed to. She looked at herself in the polished metal of the mirror Maya held up. She did not recognize herself immediately, not because she was unrecognizable. She was still herself, still the same woman who split her own wood and lived alone and had built every piece of furniture she owned, but because the woman in the mirror was wearing her face in a context that did not match any context she had worn it in for a very long time. She looked, she thought, like someone who belonged somewhere. She was not certain how she felt about that. "You are ready," Maya said, with a warmth that was genuine enough that Prymia did not know what to do with it. "I am going to a room full of clan leaders," Prymia said. "I am an Omega with no clan who lives alone in a forest. I am not certain ready is the operative concept." Maya smiled. "A real one, not the practiced kind. The operative concept," she said, "is that the king requested you specifically. In this fortress, that means something." Prymia looked at the door. "What does it mean?" she said, not quite asking. Maya did not answer, but her smile did not diminish either, and that, in its own way, was an answer. The great hall was everything her cabin was not. It was vast and high-ceilinged and lit by a quantity of candles that seemed, to her forest-accustomed eyes, almost aggressive in their abundance, great iron chandeliers above the long tables, wall sconces every few feet, candles on every surface, so that the entire hall burned with a warm and relentless golden light that left no corner to retreat into. The tables were laden in the northern fashion. Heavy platters, whole roasted things, bread that steamed, pitchers of dark ale and spiced wine, everything arranged with a generosity that was also a statement about the person doing the arranging. The hall was already half full when she arrived, the allied clan leaders and their retinues in various stages of settling and conversation, the noise level a deep and comfortable roar that rose to meet her at the door like something physical. She stopped just inside the entrance. A great many people were in this room. A great many of them were large. Several of them were looking at her. She breathed in through her nose, let the breath out slowly, and walked in. She found a place at the edge of one of the lower tables, not the high table which she understood instinctively she was not yet meant to navigate, but a position that gave her a clear view of the room and a wall at her back, which were the two things she always chose first in any space, by habit too old to be consciously maintained. She accepted the cup of wine that was offered to her and held it and did not drink it immediately because she needed her hands to have something to do and her head to stay clear, and those two requirements were intention. The man who sat down beside her had gray-streaked hair and the calm, watchful face of someone who had been observing rooms like this for a long time and had developed, through long observation, strong opinions about what he saw. "You are the woman from the forest," he said, not unkindly. She looked at him. "It seems everyone knows that." "In a room like this, everyone knows everything," he said, "usually before the people it concerns." He settled his considerable frame against the bench with the ease of someone at home in his own bones. "Sven Nygard, Clan Nygard, Western Ridge. Prymia Nightfang. No clan. No clan," she confirmed. He considered this without the judgment she had braced for. "Brave," he said, with what appeared to be genuine assessment rather than condescension, "or very good at being alone." "Both," she said, "usually at the same time." He laughed, a real one, deep and sudden, the kind that suggested it surprised him slightly. She found, against her expectations, that she did not dislike Sven Nygard. She was going to say something else. She had a response assembled, something practical and deflecting, when the hall changed. It was not a visible change, not at first. It was the sound of it, the particular shift in the texture of a crowd when a specific presence enters, the way conversation does not stop but reorganizes, redistributes its attention, tilts in a direction, the way water tilts in a vessel that is being moved. She felt it before she saw it, felt it the way she had felt the wind change direction in the forest, with her whole body rather than any single sense. She turned. Festus Goldenmoon had entered from the side door at the far end of the hall. He was dressed for the occasion. Dark tunic with the clan markings worked in dark gold thread along the collar and sleeves, a fur-lined cloak across his shoulders that he wore the way he wore everything, which was as though it had been placed there by gravity rather than choice. His red hair was pulled back, the beard tidied, and he walked the length of the hall with the absolute and unself-conscious ease of a man who had never in his life had to consider whether a room would make space for him, because rooms always made space for him, because his presence preceded him like the bow wave of something very large, moving through water. He was speaking to Victor at his shoulder, his head slightly inclined, listening to something being reported. His expression was the working expression, focused, processing, present but partitioned. And then he looked up. He was not looking for her. She was certain of that. He was scanning the room in the automatic, habitual way of someone who had spent years assessing spaces for risk and variable. The kind of look that swept and catalogued and moved on. It swept her table. It catalogued. It stopped. She watched it happen. Watched the scan interrupt itself. Watched his step not falter but pause internally. Some invisible hesitation that was over before it fully began. Victor said something, and he did not respond immediately, which she suspected was unusual. And then he did respond, briefly, without looking away from the table she was sitting at. From where she was sitting at the table, from her, she became very interested in her wine cup. Sven Nygard, who had been watching the hall with the comfortable attention of a man who noticed everything and commented on little, said nothing. But she felt him not saying it, with a specificity that suggested he had noticed considerably more than he was addressing. She did not look at Festus again for the first part of the meal. This was not because she was unaware of where he was. She was, if anything, too aware of the direction of him with a precision that was inconvenient and involuntary, the way one is aware of a fire in a dark room without looking directly at it, by the heat it displaces, by the light it throws sideways onto everything else. He was at the high table. He was speaking with the clan leaders with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood that this kind of conversation was also a kind of governance. He was doing his work. She ate. She spoke with Sven Nygard, who was dryly funny in a way she had not expected and clearly knew more about forest herbalism than his warrior bearing suggested. She answered the careful questions of the woman across the table. Sigrid Nilsson, she said, of Clan Nilsson, with eyes that were intelligent and cautious in equal measure, about where she had come from and how long she had lived in the eastern forest. She gave the minimum of each answer that was still honest, which was a calculation she had considerable practice with. She was listening to Sven describe a particularly catastrophic attempt he had made to brew fever medicine for his youngest son 3 winters ago, a story that was heading unmistakably toward a color of liquid that should not have been that color, when a shift in the air at her left made her turn. Festus was standing at the end of her table. She did not know when he had moved. That was what bothered her most. She decided in the fraction of a second she had before he met her eyes. Not his presence, not the way the table's conversation restructured itself in an instant, not even the proximity of him which was, in this smaller space, more considerable than the hall's dimensions should have permitted. What bothered her was that she had not heard him approach, and she heard everything. "Prymia Nightfang," he said. His voice, in the general noise of the hall, was low. It reached her and only her, which was either architecture or intention, and she suspected it was the latter. She looked up at him. "My king," she said in the tone she had been practicing, the one that was respectful without being deferential in the bone-level way that made her feel like she was diminishing. Something moved in his expression. "You are enjoying the evening?" "I was not asked whether I wished to have one," she said. "But yes, Sven Nygard is unexpectedly good company." Sven, from her left, said nothing with magnificent restraint. Festus looked at her for a moment. Not the working look, not the scanning assessment. Something else, something that moved more slowly and paid attention to different things she was not certain she could afford to have paid attention to while sitting at a public table in a room full of clan leaders and firelight. "Walk with me," he said. It was close enough to a question that she decided to treat it as one. She rose. The green dress moved with her, and she did not look at him while she settled it, and she did not acknowledge the quality of his stillness while she did so, which was the stillness of a man applying deliberate effort to the business of looking at something else. They moved away from the table, along the edge of the hall, toward the wide stone archway at the far end that opened into the corridor beyond. The noise of the banquet followed them, and then receded by degrees, and by the time they were through the arch and in the cooler, quieter corridor, what remained was manageable. He matched his stride to hers, which she had not expected. He could have walked faster. She suspected he always walked faster. He didn't. "You look—" He stopped. She waited. "The dress suits you," he said. The words came out with the slight excess of precision of someone who has edited a sentence and is presenting what remains after the editing. Prymia looked at the corridor ahead of them. "It was provided," she said. "I did not choose it." "I know," he said. "Maya chose it. With guidance." A pause. "With some guidance," he said. She absorbed this. "You chose the color. Green seemed appropriate." Another pause. "For the forest." She glanced at him. He was looking ahead, and the candlelight of the corridor threw the lines of his face into sharp relief. The strong jaw, the red of his beard, the dark amber of his eyes when they briefly met hers, and then went back to the corridor ahead. There was a faint color along his cheekbones that she did not think was from the warmth of the hall. Festus Goldenmoon, king of the northern clans, was, she realized with a jolt, of something that lived somewhere between wonder and alarm, embarrassed. "The forest," she said carefully, "is largely brown and gray at this time of year. The evergreens," he said without missing a beat, "they remain green." She looked at him for a moment longer than she should have. "So they do," she said. They walked. The corridor turned and opened into a smaller antechamber with a window that faced north, the darkness of the forest visible in the far distance as a deeper dark against the night sky. They stopped there, not by agreement, but by the simple fact that the window offered something to look at that was not each other, which was a relief in the way that water is a relief, its absence more apparent than its presence. He stood beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, warmth that she remembered from his fever, from 3 nights ago, from the long, careful hours of keeping him alive, with her hands and her knowledge and a will she had not known she possessed in quite that quantity until it was needed. "You are angry with me," he said, not accusingly, as a statement of fact that he considered worth acknowledging. "I was not asked," she said, "about remaining here, about the banquet, about any of it." "No," he said, "you are not." He looked at the window. "I am not practiced at asking. I noticed. I am—" He stopped again, and she had the sense of watching a man navigate terrain that was genuinely unfamiliar to him, that his considerable competence in all other terrain had not prepared him for. "I find that with you, the normal approaches do not—" He made a small, barely perceptible movement with his hand. "Produce the expected results." "The normal approach," she said, "appears to be giving orders and having them followed." "Yes. And with me." "You followed them," he said. "And then you told me exactly what was wrong with them, and then you followed them anyway." The almost smile appeared, further developed than it had been in his chamber, closer to completion. "It is a unique approach." "I live alone in a forest," she said. "I have had no one to follow orders from for a long time. The skill atrophies." He turned from the window and looked at her, fully, directly, with the whole weight of those amber eyes, and she made herself hold it because she had told herself she would not look away first, and she was a woman who kept her word, even to herself, even when keeping it was more difficult than she had initially budgeted for. "Tell me about the forest," he said, quietly, without the authority of command in it, just a request, simple and undecorated, the same way his acknowledgement of his debt had been simple and undecorated. She was beginning to understand that this was the truest register of his voice. Not the commanding tone, not the working tone, but this one, low and direct and stripped of performance. She looked at him for a moment, and then, because the corridor was quiet and the banquet was distant, and the window showed her the shape of something she loved against the dark sky, she began to tell him. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him how she had come to be there, or what she had left behind, or the specific weight of the morning she had walked into those trees and decided she would not be walking back out. She told him about the river sound in winter, when the cold slowed it, but did not stop it. She told him about the herb cycles, the ones that her grandmother had taught her, and the ones she had found herself through years of patient attention. She told him about the elk that came to the clearing in the early morning, the ones that had stopped startling at her presence after the 2nd year, and now simply looked at her and went on with their business. He listened. Not in the way that people sometimes listened, with the waiting shape of their own next words, visible in their expression, with the polite performance of attention. He listened the way he had looked at her in his chamber, with the full and genuine presence of someone who was interested in the specific thing being said rather than the general activity of conversation. She found it, against her best intentions, deeply difficult to stop talking. She caught herself. "I am telling you more than I intended," she said. "I know," he said. "I did not want you to stop." The corridor was very quiet. She looked at the window again, at the dark line of her forest against the sky, at the stars above it, at the same stars she looked at from her own window when sleep did not come easily, which was often. "I want to go home," she said. It came out differently than it had in his chamber, less like a demand and more like something she was saying to the window, rather than to him, something she was reminding herself of. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. And then, more quietly still, in a tone that she turned to look at him for because it contained something she had not heard from him before, something that sounded almost painfully like honesty. "I am not yet ready for that." She looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the dark line of her forest, at the same stars. The warmth of the banquet hall found them faintly through the stone, and distantly, as if from another world entirely, she could hear the sound of the clan leaders talking and the low notes of someone beginning to play a stringed instrument, the first few testing notes of something northern and old and aching in the way that northern music always ached, as if it knew something about longing that the people playing it could not quite put into words. Prymia stood beside the king of the northern clans in a corridor that smelled of stone and candle wax, in a dress the color of evergreens, and did not go back to the banquet. Neither did he. They stayed at the window until the stars shifted, talking about small things and vast things and the spaces between them, and she learned that he had a brother he had lost, and he learned that she could identify 14 species of lichen by touch alone, and neither of them addressed the thing that was building in the air between them with the patience and inevitability of a northern winter, gathering, deepening, becoming undeniable one quiet moment at a time. Outside, the forest stood dark and still and waiting. And inside a corridor of a stone fortress, two people who had found each other in the dark were learning, with the careful and frightened attention of those who have been alone long enough to understand what it costs, that sometimes the thing you are found by is the thing that finds you back. The news came on the 5th morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Victor brought it himself, which told Prymia more than the words did. Victor was a man who delegated with precision, who understood that his own presence was a resource to be spent carefully and only where its weight was warranted. When he appeared at her door in the gray pre-dawn light, with his cloak still carrying the cold of the courtyard, and his expression arranged with the particular stillness of someone carrying something significant, she understood before he spoke that the thing she had been waiting for, without fully admitting she was waiting for it, had arrived. "It is done," he said. She stepped back from the door to let him in. He told her quickly and without elaboration, the way he told everything. The traitor had been Caspar Falk, third seat on the Allied Council, a man who had smiled across banquet tables for 6 years, while quietly negotiating the terms of his king's death with a rival clan who had promised him the Western Ridge territories in exchange for a clear path to the throne. The poisoned blade had been arranged through intermediaries, the attack coordinated to coincide with Festus riding alone on the eastern route, a path he had taken every month for years, with the regularity of a man who had never developed the habit of varying his patterns because no one had yet given him sufficient reason to. Prymia had given him sufficient reason. Not intentionally. She had given him nothing except a poultice and a night of careful attention and a cup of bitter medicine administered a spoonful at a time in the dark. But what she had heard in those dark hours, the fragmented, fever-fractured words that she had filed quietly as things not meant for her, as the private wreckage that illness pulls to the surface without permission, had contained, buried among the grief and the commands and the single word forgive that had surfaced clear and alone from everything else, something Victor had recognized when she described it to him. Sven. Fall back. She had thought it was a name. It was a name. But it was also a specific command given at a specific moment in a battle 3 years ago, a battle in which Sven Nygard's eastern flank had been destroyed by an ambush that should not have been possible unless someone with knowledge of the king's tactical communications had passed them to the opposing force. Sven had survived. 14 of his men had not. The ambush had never been explained, and the guilt of it had lived in Festus Goldenmoon ever since. The belief that his command had been too slow, that he had called the retreat a breath too late, that those 14 deaths belonged in some measure to him. They did not belong to him. Victor had known where to look once he had the thread. Caspar Falk's correspondence, his movements, his financial records, all of it had unraveled with the speed of something that had been held together by luck and proximity to power rather than genuine craft. The confession, when it came, had been almost anticlimactic. Men like Caspar Falk, Victor had found, were often that way, enormous in their ambition and surprisingly small in their willingness to bear its consequences when it collapsed. "The council convenes this morning," Victor said. "He will answer to them." He paused. "The king wishes to speak with you before that happens." Prymia looked at the window. The pre-dawn gray was thinning at its edges, the first suggestion of color beginning to press against the dark from somewhere below the horizon. She had slept badly and known she would, and had not fought it. Had lain awake in the too soft bed in the too large room and listened to the fortress breathe around her, and thought about a conversation in a corridor, about the dark line of her forest against a night sky, about the way a man who commanded everything had said, "I am not yet ready for that," in a voice that had no command in it at all. "I know where to find him," she said. Victor looked at her for a moment with that expression she had still not fully decoded, the one that required a category he had not yet shared with her. Then he inclined his head and left, and she dressed in the gray light and bound her braids with the dark cord that Maya had left on the table and went to find the king. He was in the east courtyard, not in his chamber, not in the council room, not in any of the interior spaces where the business of being what he was conducted itself with relentless and consuming regularity. He was outside, standing at the eastern wall where the stone was oldest, and the mortar between the blocks had been repaired so many times it had become a record of every winter the fortress had survived, looking out toward the tree line in the early morning light, with his hands at his sides and his red hair loose in the cold air, and an expression on his face that she had not seen there before. Not the working face, not the commanding face, not even the careful and cautious face she had begun to learn in corridors and over shared windows. Something older than all of those, something that lived underneath them. She stopped beside him. He did not turn. He had heard her. She knew that a man like him heard everything, that his senses had been sharpened by years of existing in situations where not hearing things had permanent consequences. He simply waited, the way he had waited before speaking to her the first night in his chamber, with the deliberateness of someone choosing their moment rather than missing it. "Caspar Falk," she said, because she thought it was what should be said first. "Yes?" His voice was flat and clean, the way it was when he had already processed something, and what remained was only the fact of it. "Victor told you. This morning." He was quiet for a moment. The eastern light was growing, pale gold beginning to replace the gray, the tops of the distant trees catching it first, the way trees always did, their height making them the first to receive what the light was offering. "The battle 3 years ago," he said. "The men I lost on the eastern flank." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I have carried that since it happened, the certainty that I had commanded it wrong." "You didn't," she said. "No." The word came out with a complicated weight. Not relief, or not only relief, something that relief looks like after it has traveled through grief and arrived changed. "What you heard that night, what I said without knowing I was saying it, it was the piece that completed it, that made the rest of the evidence legible." He turned and looked at her. "You could not have known what it meant." "I didn't," she said. "I only heard a man trying to save someone." Something moved across his face. "Sven," he said. "He is—" He stopped, reorganized. "He is my oldest friend. What happened to his flank that day has been between us ever since, even when neither of us spoke of it. He never blamed me. That was somehow worse." He looked back at the tree line. "To have that resolved, to know the truth of it, is something I did not expect to be given." Prymia looked at the side of his face. At the set of his jaw, and the red of his beard, and the way the morning light was changing the color of his hair from ember to copper, and she thought about a man delirious with fever, still trying to call a retreat, still trying to protect someone, even from the far side of consciousness. She thought about what that said about who he was when no one was watching. "It was not your fault," she said. Simply, without decoration. He was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said at last, and the two words held more in them than most speeches. They stood in the growing light, and she thought about the 5 days she had spent inside these walls, the strangeness of them, the unexpected conversations, the way the stone had begun to feel less foreign and more like simply a different kind of shelter than the one she was accustomed to. She thought about Sven Nygård and his laugh, and Maya's practical kindness, and Elin Johansson in the herb stores, and Victor's impossible-to-read face, and she thought about how a place became a place through the accumulation of small, specific things rather than through any single, large one. "Victor tells me the danger has passed," she said. "It has. Then there is no longer a reason for me to stay." He turned from the wall and looked at her fully, and she held it, held his gaze the way she had decided she always would, because she had told herself she would not look away first, and she kept her word even when keeping it cost her something. "There is no tactical reason," he said. "No." She waited. "I would like to take you home," he said. "Myself. Today." He paused. "If you will allow it." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was full now, gold and clear, and it made everything look like something that was being seen for the first time. "Yes," she said. They rode with 2 guards at a distance that was far enough to be a courtesy and close enough to be a formality. And for most of the journey, neither of them said very much, which was not the silence of people who have run out of things to say, but the silence of people who are saving what they have for when the right moment arrives to say it. The road east was familiar to her feet, if not to her eyes from horseback, and the trees grew taller and closer as they went, the light changing quality as the canopy thickened, and she felt something in her chest ease by degrees with every mile, a tension she had not fully identified while she carried it, recognizable only in the relief of its loosening. When the path narrowed to the width of a single horse, she went first, and he followed, and she heard his breathing change slightly as the forest closed around them, not with discomfort, not with the unease of a man in unfamiliar terrain, but with something she understood, because she had felt it herself the first time she had ridden into this particular depth of trees, years ago. Recognition. As if the forest were saying something his body already knew how to hear. The cabin appeared through the trees the way it always did. Gradually, the shape of it assembling itself from the surrounding wood and shadow, the dark timber of the walls, and the stone of the chimney, and the small north-facing window that caught no direct sun and was therefore always cool, which she had intended because that was where she stored the medicines that heat would damage. She dismounted. He dismounted behind her and stood for a moment in the clearing, looking at it. Just looking, with the full and quiet attention she had learned to recognize as his most honest register, the one that appeared when he was not performing any version of himself for any audience, when it was only the thing he was looking at and whatever he actually thought about it. She opened the door and went inside. He followed. She had not seen it through his eyes before, had not had occasion to, since the last time he had been in it. He had been unconscious and bleeding and in no condition to see anything. She watched him see it now, the low ceiling and the single window and the fire she had banked days ago that had long since gone cold, the table she had built from pine boards with joints that were slightly uneven because she had learned joinery by doing it rather than by being taught, the shelves with their rows of jars and bundles, the herbs hanging from the ceiling in their careful, ordered groupings, the medicine box beneath the table, the chair, the bed. He stopped at the bed. He stood beside it and looked at it for a long moment. The narrow pine frame, the packed wool mattress, the linen that she had never replaced, that still carried the ghost of what the cold water in her basin had not been able to fully remove. He reached out and touched the frame, once, briefly, with the tips of his fingers. "This is where you brought me," he said. "It is the only bed," she said from by the table. "There was no other option. You slept in the chair. You were taking the bed." He turned and looked at her across the small cabin, across the distance of 6 or 7 paces that was all the cabin offered, that was in its own way no distance at all. The light coming through the window was the thin, greenish light of the forest, the kind that had been filtered through 100 layers of canopy before it arrived and carried the texture of all of them, and it lay across his face in a way that made him look different from any version of him she had seen at the fortress. Less like a king, more like himself. "You sat in that chair," he said, "through a fever that could have killed me, through the whole of the night alone for a man whose name you did not know." "I am a healer," she said. "It is what I do." "It is not what you did." He did not say it with correction, but with a precision that made the distinction clear. "You stayed. There is a difference between doing what one does and choosing to stay." He looked at her steadily. "I know the difference. I have rarely experienced it." Prymia was quiet. He moved away from the bed, slowly, with the deliberateness that was becoming familiar, that she had come to understand was not hesitation, but intention, and stopped at the table where she stood. Close enough that the warmth of him was present in the cool air of the cabin, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker amber deep in his eyes, close enough that there was no useful distance left between them to retreat into, and she found, when she examined this honestly, that she did not want any. "I have ruled alone for 12 years, he said. His voice was low and even, carrying nothing but the specific weight of what it was saying. "My father died when I was 20. My brother." He stopped. The word forgive surfaced in her memory, alone and clear from the fever wreckage of that long night. "My brother died before that. I took what I was given and I built what I could from it, and I told myself that solitude was the appropriate condition for the thing I had become." He paused. "I had good arguments for it. I had rehearsed them for years. They were convincing." "Were?" she said. "Were," he confirmed. She looked up at him. The cabin was very small. The forest outside was very quiet. "I have lived alone for 8 years, she said, because he had offered her something, and she understood it required something in return. "I came here because I had, because there were things I could not remain near. A family that had sold my future to a man I could not bear, for reasons that were practical and entirely indifferent to what I was. An omega without leverage, which is to say an omega in the usual condition." She felt the old bitterness rise and pass, the way it always did, present and then gone, like weather. "I came here, and I built this, and I made it enough. I had convinced myself it was enough." "Had," he said, with the same precision she had used. "Had," she said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He reached into the inner pocket of his cloak with the careful movement of a man who has been thinking about this particular motion for longer than he is going to admit, and when his hand came out, it held something small. She looked at it. A ring. Silver, old and northern-made, with the clean and unpretentious lines of something functional rather than decorative. No stone. She could see markings on the inner face, runes, small and precise, the kind that were meant to be read by the person wearing it rather than the people looking at it. She did not reach for it yet. "What does it say?" she said. "The inside." He looked down at it briefly. "It is my family's oldest marking," he said, "the one that was on my mother's ring. It means—" He paused, and she watched him choose between translation and accuracy, and choose accuracy. "Approximately, she who holds the other half." He looked up. It was my grandmother's understanding that a person is not complete, that there is a half that one carries and a half that exists elsewhere, and that finding it is the whole business of a life. A pause. She was a very practical woman. She would not have been patient with sentiment. This was her version of sentiment. Prymia looked at the ring in his hand. She thought about the wind changing direction in a dark forest, about following a smell she should not have followed, to a place she should not have gone, toward a man who had told her, with the last of his conscious breath, to go away. She thought about the long night in the chair and the fever and the first gray light of dawn coming through the window while she slept. She thought about corridors and green wool and the dark shape of her forest against a night sky shared with someone standing beside her. She thought about how, in all the years she had lived alone in this forest, she had become very good at knowing when something was true. "You are not asking me," she said carefully, "because you are practiced at commanding. You said so." "I said I was not practiced at asking," he said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, that almost smile, and this time it completed itself, fully and without reservation, and it did to his face what she had suspected it would do the first time she had seen it approach completion. It made him look like someone who had been waiting, for a very long time, to be allowed to look like that. "I am asking." She looked at him, at the ring, at the window and the forest beyond it, the trees she knew by name, the river she could hear faintly from here when the wind was right, the life she had built board by board and stone by stone over 8 years of deliberate and necessary solitude. The life that had begun to feel, for the past 5 days, like a rehearsal for something she had not yet named. "The cabin stays," she said. He looked at her. "It is mine," she said. "I built it. Whatever else changes, this stays. I will want to return to it. We will return to it," he said without a pause, without qualification, with the absolute certainty of a man who has made a decision and means everything it requires. She held out her hand. He placed the ring in it, warm from his pocket, smooth and old under her fingers, and then his hand closed around hers, gently, with the particular care she recognized from the banquet corridor and the window, and every moment in which he had navigated the distance between what he was and what he was when he was with her. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. One word, the only word the moment needed, the only word that held everything she meant without losing any of it in the translation. The answer to his question, and the end of the longest argument she had ever had with herself, and the beginning of whatever came next, which was enormous and unknowable, and standing here in the middle of her cabin on a cold morning, looking at her with amber eyes that were, she discovered, entirely undone. He exhaled, a long, quiet exhale, the kind that a body makes when it has been holding something for longer than it should have and has finally been given permission to release it. He was still holding her hand. She let him. Outside, the forest stood in its morning light, the same light it had stood in every morning for the 8 years she had lived in it, patient and indifferent and vast. The same trees, the same river sound in the distance, the same birds resuming their interrupted conversations in the canopy above, everything exactly as she had left it. And inside the small cabin she had built for solitude, a woman who had learned to make herself enough stood with her hand in the hand of a man who had learned the same, and they stood together in the space where 2 long rehearsals had ended and looked at each other, and neither of them was afraid, or rather, they were both afraid. And it turned out that this was the same thing as not being afraid. When the thing you are afraid of is also the truest thing that has ever happened to you. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so simple and so old that it carried the weight of every northern story that had ever used it, of every winter that had ever ended, of everything that has ever been found after being genuinely lost. "Come," he said quietly, when he lifted his head. "Let us go home." She looked around the cabin one last time, at the table and the chair and the herbs on the ceiling, and the bed with its ghost of a stain that she was never going to replace the linen around. She understood that now. At the life she had built, which had been real and was still real and would remain real because she was taking it with her in every way that mattered. She picked up her medicine box from beneath the table. She walked to the door. She went home. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.